My son-in-law sold my wedding ring to pay off his debt. He had no idea what I would do next, but the moment I learned the truth, my entire world shifted. That ring was not just gold or diamonds. It was the circle of love my wife and I shared for 40 years, the promise we made on the day we stood in front of God and everyone we loved. It was the last physical memory I had of her, a piece of her I could hold when nights were too quiet, when her voice was only an echo in my dreams. And he took it. Not by mistake, not in desperation for food or survival, but to pay off dirty gambling debts he had no business making in the first place. Do you understand the weight of that betrayal? It was as though he spat on my wife's grave and smiled while doing it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. I remember the moment I discovered it. I had opened the small velvet box where the ring always rested when I was too afraid to wear it on my finger for fear of losing it. That box sat in my drawer like a heartbeat. When I lifted the lid and found it empty, a coldness spread through me. My hands shook, my vision blurred, and I asked myself over and over if I had moved it, if perhaps my aging memory was playing cruel tricks. But no, deep down, I already knew. There was only one person who had both the gall and the access to take it. When I confronted him, he did not even flinch. He leaned back on my daughter's couch, his arms stretched arrogantly across the cushions, and smirked. "It's just a ring," he said, as though those words were enough to erase my lifetime of memories, as though the value of love, sacrifice, and devotion could be measured by the weight of gold. His voice was dripping with entitlement, and in that instant I saw him for what he truly was. Not a husband to my daughter, not a man deserving of respect, just a leech feeding off everything I had built, everything my wife and I had sacrificed. I felt my chest tighten, not from age or weakness, but from fury. How many times had I helped them, paid their bills when they were drowning, fixed their house when they could not afford repairs, handed over money with a smile and a prayer that they would get back on their feet? I had believed in family, in giving, in patience, but what had it earned me? My generosity had not been gratitude to them. It had been fuel, a bottomless well they could draw from, laughing behind my back at how easy I was to use. That day, with the echo of his dismissive words ringing in my ears, I knew something inside me had snapped. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, my kindness for stupidity. They had forgotten that the man they thought could be exploited was the same man who had built everything they enjoyed with his own two hands. And now, with my wife's memory desecrated, I promised myself something I had never promised before. They would regret this. Every word, every sneer, every ounce of greed. They thought they had taken a ring, but what they really took was the last of my silence. And that, I swore, would cost them everything. When I opened that drawer and saw the empty velvet box, a silence heavier than any thunderclap filled the room, a silence that pressed against my chest and left me gasping. My fingers trembled as I touched the hollow space where the ring should have been, my heart pounding with a rhythm that felt foreign, almost violent. For a moment I could not move, could not think, only stare at that void as if the force of my will could make the ring reappear, as if wishing hard enough might turn back time and place it safely where it belonged. My mind played cruel tricks on me, whispering that maybe I had misplaced it, maybe I had moved it in one of those restless nights when sleep refused me and I found myself wandering through old memories, clutching at keepsakes to remind me of her. But I knew the truth. I had never once allowed that ring to leave its place because it was more than jewelry, it was her. It was the echo of her laughter in our kitchen, the warmth of her hand in mine on winter walks, the symbol of promises that death itself had not erased. That ring was not just an object. It was the vessel of my love, my devotion, my grief, and my endurance. To see it gone was to feel like someone had reached into my chest and stolen the last living piece of my wife. The disbelief was suffocating. Every corner of the room seemed to tilt and close in around me, and my breath came shallow, sharp, as I staggered back against the dresser. I whispered her name, as if she might answer, as if she might reassure me that I was mistaken. But the silence was louder than ever. In that moment, betrayal coursed through me like ice water. How could he, that arrogant boy who had married my daughter, look at me, look at the life my wife and I had built, and strip away the one thing I had guarded most carefully? I wanted to tell myself there had been no malice, that perhaps desperation had driven him, but the more I thought, the more I knew his greed had guided his hand. To him, it was only gold, something to be bartered for quick cash, a shiny trinket without meaning. To me, it was the heartbeat of the woman I loved. My chest tightened again as I sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at that box, my hands shaking violently, a low sound escaping my throat that was neither cry nor shout but something in between, a wounded thing that I did not recognize as my own. I remembered the day I slipped that ring onto her finger, the way her eyes glistened with joy, the way her voice trembled when she vowed her life to mine. That memory crashed against the cruel reality before me, and I felt my disbelief give way to a rage so deep it burned cold instead of hot. This was not just theft. This was desecration, and it would not stand. I sat there staring at the empty box, and my mind drifted back through the long years that had brought me to this point, each memory cutting deeper than the last. When my wife passed, it was my daughter and I against the world. She was still so young then, barely out of school, her eyes red from tears she did not want me to see, her voice breaking when she asked me how we were supposed to go on without her mother. I promised her I would take care of her no matter what, and I meant it with every ounce of my being. I worked long hours, took every shift I could, and when I came home bone-tired, I still made sure dinner was warm on the table, her homework checked, and her worries soothed. I carried both roles, father and mother, protector and nurturer, and I bore the weight without complaint because she was all I had left of the woman I loved. As the years passed, I watched her grow, watched her laugh again, watched her find pieces of happiness I thought were lost to us forever. When she told me she had met a man, my heart clenched with both fear and hope. I wanted her to have love, to build a family of her own, but I also feared she would choose someone who would never understand the sacrifices that had been made for her. Still, I welcomed him. I opened my home. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because my daughter loved him. When they decided to marry, who do you think paid for most of the wedding? I did. With the money I had quietly saved over years, money I could have kept for my old age, but instead spent gladly to see her smile. When they struggled to afford a home, I stepped in again. I handed over a large portion of my savings, helping them secure a mortgage, telling myself it was an investment in her happiness. I painted walls, repaired plumbing, and even built their back deck with my own 2 hands. Every nail I hammered in was a reminder of the sacrifices my wife and I had made, and I told myself I was doing right by our daughter, giving her the stability and love her mother would have wanted her to have. But as I look back now, I see the pattern I ignored. I see the way he always expected, the way he let me do the heavy lifting while basking in the comfort of what was provided. I see how my daughter, blinded by love or perhaps trapped by fear, never spoke against him, never questioned the way he took without gratitude. And I see myself, year after year, pouring out everything I had in the name of family, believing that love and sacrifice would one day be honored, only to discover that to him it meant nothing. All those years of sweat and devotion had built the very platform from which he dared to betray me. I confronted him the very evening I discovered the ring was gone, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest, and when I demanded to know what he had done with it, he did not even attempt shame or apology. He lounged on the couch as though he were the master of the house, one arm draped lazily across the backrest, the other scrolling idly on his phone, and when I spoke of the ring, his lips curled into that smug grin I had grown to despise. "It was just sitting there," he said with a shrug, his tone dripping with indifference, "collecting dust in some drawer. You weren't wearing it, so what difference does it make? You're not going to marry anyone again." Those words struck me like a slap, stripping me of breath, and yet he kept talking, utterly unbothered by the devastation etched across my face. "I got a good price for it, too," he added, like he was proud of himself, like he had done something clever, and it went to something useful. Paid off a chunk of debt that was hanging over us. You should be thanking me for handling things instead of crying over an old piece of jewelry. My hands clenched at my sides, knuckles white, the blood roaring in my ears. To him, my wife's ring was nothing but gold and stone, stripped of meaning, an object to be converted into cash for his reckless choices. He looked at me like I was foolish for caring, like love and memory and devotion were outdated concepts, relics as meaningless as the ring he had pawned. I tried to speak, to tell him what that ring meant, how it was the last tangible connection I had to the woman who had been my partner through every storm, but he waved me off with a laugh that stung worse than his words. "You're overreacting," he said, shaking his head as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "You've still got your memories, don't you? That should be enough for an old man like you." The arrogance in his voice, the way he dismissed decades of love with a single wave of his hand, ignited something deep inside me that I had not felt in years. He believed himself untouchable, so certain that I would swallow this insult like I had swallowed so many others. He believed my silence meant weakness, my patience meant stupidity, and his eyes gleamed with that unspoken challenge, daring me to prove otherwise. In that moment, as I stood in the living room of the very house my money had helped them buy, staring at the man who had stolen my wife's ring and dared to laugh at my pain, I realized he had no idea what I was capable of. He thought he had beaten me down, but all he had done was awaken a resolve he would soon regret ever testing. What cut deeper than his arrogance was the silence that followed, the silence that came not from him, but from my own daughter, the little girl I had raised alone, the one whose tears I had wiped when her mother died, the one I had worked myself to the bone for so she could grow up without feeling the crushing weight of poverty on top of grief. She was there in that room when I confronted him, standing by the doorway with her arms folded, her eyes darting between us, and though she saw the fury in my eyes and heard the contempt in his voice, she said nothing. Not one word to defend me, not one whisper of outrage that the symbol of her mother's love had been sold for pocket change to cover his vices. I looked at her, silently begging her to speak, to remind me that she was still the girl who once clung to my hand and told me I was her hero, but all I found was hesitation and fear. When I asked her directly if she knew, her lips parted but no sound came, and her gaze fell to the floor like a guilty child caught in a lie. That silence echoed louder than any scream. In her quietness, I heard his grip on her life. The way he controlled the money, the way he convinced her that I was only a backup resource, a well to be drawn from whenever their own recklessness ran them dry. I had seen glimpses of it before. The way she deferred to him, the way her laughter seemed forced when he was near, the way she avoided meeting my eyes when she asked for money. But I had always told myself she was happy, that she had chosen this life, that perhaps I was only imagining shadows where none existed. Now, staring at her silence, I realized how deep his influence ran. It was not just arrogance that fueled him, but the quiet complicity of the woman who should have stood by me. And yet, I could not hate her. My heart ached because I saw in her the girl who once trusted me to protect her, and I knew he had wrapped his hands so tightly around her that she no longer knew how to speak without his permission. But the pain of her silence, the betrayal of her choosing him over me in that moment, seared into my chest like fire. My wife's ring was gone, my daughter's voice was gone, and all that remained was me standing alone in a house I had helped pay for, staring at the wreckage of everything I had built. He smirked while she stayed silent, and in that unbearable moment I swore to myself that one day he would regret teaching her to choose silence over truth. I sat alone later that night, staring at the shadows crawling along the walls, and the weight of everything I had done for them pressed down on me like a mountain. I thought of the countless times I had opened my wallet without hesitation, not because I had excess to spare, but because I believed family meant sacrifice, that love meant giving without keeping score. I remembered the nights I stayed up late, balancing my own bills and debts just so I could slip them a check the next morning, telling myself they needed it more than I did. I thought of the weekends I spent repairing their leaking pipes, fixing their broken fences, patching up their roof, sweat pouring down my back as he lounged with a beer in his hand, bragging about how his friends envied the house he owned, a house he never would have had without my blood and labor. Each memory stabbed deeper, and I asked myself over and over how I could have been so blind. Had I mistaken exploitation for gratitude? Had I confused manipulation with love? They had smiled at me, thanked me with hollow words, but beneath it all I see now that they viewed me as nothing more than a resource, a safety net to catch them whenever their own foolishness led them to the edge. I had convinced myself I was helping my daughter build a stable life, but in truth I had been laying bricks for the prison he kept her in, tightening his hold with every sacrifice I made. And what did it earn me? My wife's wedding ring, the most sacred symbol of our love, pawned away like trash to feed his addictions. My daughter's silence, the one voice I thought would never fail me, buried under fear and manipulation. My own dignity, eroded piece by piece until he believed he could spit on my memories and laugh in my face without consequence. Sitting there in the dim light, I felt the years of sacrifice turn sour in my mouth, tasted the bitterness of realizing I had been nothing more than their servant. I thought of my wife, of the promise I made to her as she lay fading in that hospital bed, that I would protect our daughter, that I would ensure she never felt abandoned. Had I failed her? Or had I simply mistaken coddling for protection and in doing so handed our daughter to a man who would strip away her strength? My chest ached with more than grief. It ached with betrayal, not only by him but by the blindness I had chosen to live with. I saw it all clearly now. They had not exploited me once or twice. This had been their pattern all along, a cycle of taking and taking while I convinced myself I was giving out of love. That realization burned hotter than any insult. I was not weak. I had been too trusting, and I swore to myself in that moment that I would no longer be their well to draw from. They had drained me for the last time. I sat in the darkness with the hollow velvet box still in my hand, and something inside me hardened in a way I had never felt before. The grief was still there, sharp and cutting, but it began to transform into something colder, heavier, unshakable. For years I had told myself that patience was strength, that forgiveness was noble, that silence kept the peace. I had endured his arrogance, his laziness, his endless demands, and I had swallowed my pride again and again for the sake of my daughter. But this was different. This was not just another request for money or another weekend spent fixing the mistakes he was too lazy to address. This was the desecration of the one thing in my life that was beyond negotiation, the last link to the woman who had given me everything. To take her ring and toss it away like spare change was not just disrespect, it was unforgivable. I felt my heart beat steady and strong in my chest, not with rage but with a resolve that cooled the fire burning inside me. I realized at that moment that I had reached the end of my patience. There would be no more checks, no more repairs, no more quiet nods while he took and took. The man who had sat smirking in my living room believed he had power over me, believed he could strip me of dignity and memory alike without consequence. He thought my silence meant weakness, but he was wrong. My silence had only been the armor I wore to keep peace, but now that armor was shattered, and what stood beneath it was a man who had lost everything he cherished and who had nothing left to lose. That makes a man dangerous. My emotional pain settled into a cold determination, each thought sharpening into a plan before I even realized I was thinking it. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and in doing so, he had awakened something he would come to fear. I looked around my house, at the walls I had built with my own hands, at the photographs of my wife and daughter smiling from years when life was simpler, and I whispered a vow into the silence: he would pay for this. Not with fists or shouting, because that would be too easy, too forgettable. No, I would strike him where it would hurt the most, in the comfort he thought was guaranteed, in the security he believed he had built on my back. He would learn that every step of his life had been paved by me, and he would watch those stones crumble one by one until he had nothing. My wife's memory demanded justice, and my heart demanded retribution. For the first time in years, I felt clarity, and it was as sharp and unforgiving as a blade. The breaking point had come, and from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. It was a few days after the confrontation when the truth about his debts fell into my lap, not because he confessed or because my daughter finally found her voice, but because arrogance always leaves cracks wide enough for the truth to spill through. I had gone to their house to drop off a box of tools I had borrowed, though in truth I was there to see with my own eyes how far he had sunk after pawning off my wife's ring. As I walked up the driveway, their voices drifted through an open window, carried on the lazy afternoon air. I stopped, unseen, my hand tightening around the handle of the box as I caught his tone, sharp and defensive, not the smug confidence he usually wore around me. He was on the phone, and though he tried to lower his voice, his words sliced clearly through the silence. "I told you I'd have it by Friday," he hissed, his voice trembling with a panic I had never heard before. "No, I don't care how you do it. Just give me one more week. You know I've got connections, I'll pay. Just don't send anyone here." My stomach knotted as I leaned closer, each word confirming what I had long suspected but never proven. This was no simple credit card bill or overdue loan. He was entangled with people who dealt in threats, people who did not send polite letters in the mail, but men who knocked on doors in the middle of the night and demanded payment with fists if necessary. I heard him curse under his breath, his tone growing frantic. "I sold the ring, all right. That barely made a dent. I'm working on something bigger, but you've got to give me time. If she finds out, it'll be hell, and if her old man finds out, well, he's too stupid to notice anyway." My chest tightened at those words, the insult rolling off his tongue so casually, as though I were nothing but an old fool to be bled dry. I stood there, the weight of realization pressing down harder than the box of tools in my hand. This was not just carelessness. This was danger creeping into my daughter's life, danger he had invited through greed and arrogance. He had sold my wife's ring, yes, but that had only been a drop in the ocean of debt he had amassed. And now I understood why his arrogance seemed forced, why he lounged and smirked even when the walls were closing in. He was drowning, and he thought he could use me as the lifeline to keep himself afloat. For the first time, I saw clearly what kind of man he truly was, not just entitled and lazy, but reckless enough to drag my daughter into the jaws of wolves without a second thought. My hand clenched around the box, my jaw tight, and in that moment the cold resolve inside me deepened. This was no longer just about betrayal. It was about protection. He had put her in the line of fire, and if he thought I would stand by quietly, he had gravely miscalculated. The morning after overhearing his desperate call, I knew what I had to do. Emotion alone could not undo the damage he had caused, nor could rage silence the threats closing in on my daughter's life. If I was going to put an end to this, it had to be done methodically, with precision, with the kind of planning he would never expect from the man he believed was too old, too tired, too soft. I called my lawyer first, a man I had known for years, someone who had guided me through the storm after my wife passed. His voice was calm and professional as always, but I could hear the flicker of concern when I told him I needed to review my will, my accounts, and my assets in detail. When we met in his office later that afternoon, the smell of leather-bound books and polished wood filling the air, he slid the folders across the table and began to go over everything line by line. I listened carefully, asking pointed questions I had never asked before, because now every detail mattered. I wanted to know exactly where my money was, what property was tied to my name, and what loopholes existed that could ensure none of it would ever fall into my son-in-law's greedy hands. From there, I went to my financial advisor, a sharp woman who had always treated my modest savings with the care of a fortune. She looked at me curiously as I asked about restructuring accounts, shifting investments, and securing certain funds in trusts that bypassed in-laws entirely. I could see the calculation in her eyes as she began to map out the strategy, moving pieces on the chessboard of my finances that I had never paid much attention to before. Together we drew up plans that would safeguard everything I had built, walls of paper and ink that no amount of charm or manipulation could penetrate. It was strange, almost empowering, to see how much control I still had when I thought I had given everything away. The law and the numbers, when arranged correctly, could become weapons just as sharp as any blade. As I signed the documents, my hand steady and deliberate, I thought of his smug grin, the way he had waved off my pain as though it were nothing, and I felt a grim satisfaction knowing the ground was already shifting beneath his feet. He believed me powerless, but in reality, I held the strings, and with the right tug, his entire illusion of security would unravel. I left those offices with copies of papers tucked carefully into my briefcase, each page a shield, each signature a step closer to justice. The professionals had not asked for details, and I had not offered them, but in their efficient silence, I found validation. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about protecting my daughter, and about ensuring that the man who sold my wife's memory for scraps would one day find himself stripped of everything he valued. That evening I spread the folders across my dining room table, the weight of years condensed into paper and ink, each document a reminder of sacrifices made and responsibilities carried. My lawyer and financial advisor had been thorough, and as I leafed through the wills, the trusts, the property deeds, I began to see clearly what I still possessed. For so long I had believed myself drained, convinced that every penny had been funneled into propping up their lives, but here, in black and white, lay the truth. I still held more than he ever imagined. The house I lived in, fully paid off, stood in my name alone, an asset he could never touch. The land I had inherited from my father, modest though it seemed, carried value that only grew with time, and it, too, was secure. The accounts I had structured long ago, the life insurance policies I had left untouched, even the pension quietly accruing each month, all together, they painted a picture of stability that my son-in-law would never have credited to me. He thought me a foolish old man who handed out scraps to keep peace, but in truth, I had been more careful than he realized, and those quiet reserves now gleamed like weapons waiting to be drawn. I read through my will, the familiar ache surfacing as I saw my wife's name still etched in old clauses, and then my daughter's name appearing as beneficiary. But I paused, the pen in my hand, as I thought of her silence, of the way she had lowered her eyes rather than defend me. My heart broke all over again, but I knew this was the moment to act, to protect her even from herself. I adjusted provisions, tightening language so that nothing would ever flow through him, ensuring that if anything happened to me, my daughter would be secure while he would be left with nothing but the emptiness he deserved. The property deeds, stamped and notarized, felt heavier in my hands than any weapon. They were proof that the life I had built was still mine to command, and I began to see how easily I could sever him from it all. He had believed the lies he told himself, that he had already absorbed me into his orbit, that my sacrifices were his entitlement, but he had no idea that I had always kept something back, some part of myself, and my life's work that remained untouched. That realization filled me with a calm I had not felt since before my wife died. As I tucked each document into its proper folder, locking them away in a safe only I could open, I whispered to myself that the balance had shifted. He thought he had stripped me of power, but the truth lay before me. The assets, the deeds, the accounts were mine to wield, and with them I would dismantle every false foundation he had built. He had stolen my wife's ring, but he would never steal my resolve, and soon enough he would learn just how wrong he had been to underestimate me. I spent the next several weeks in deliberate silence, my every move measured, my every decision cloaked in discretion. On the surface, nothing had changed. I still visited my daughter, still nodded politely when he smirked and spoke as though he were king of the castle, but behind closed doors I was shifting the very ground beneath his feet. I began with the accounts, moving funds into trusts that named my daughter directly but locked her husband out completely. The lawyer and advisor worked with clinical precision, structuring everything so that not a dime could ever fall into his grasp. no matter how charming or manipulative he tried to be. I thought of my daughter often as I signed those documents, her silence replaying in my mind like a wound that refused to close. But beneath that silence, I knew she was still my little girl. She was tangled in his web, but one day she would need protection, and I would not fail her again. My pen carved out the safeguards she could not make for herself. Even if she resented me now, even if she never understood, until the day came when she saw him for what he was. I restructured the life insurance policies, adjusted beneficiaries, and shifted certain investments into accounts she alone could access, though not immediately. Everything required careful planning, layers of security, legal knots too tight for him to untangle. At the same time, I pulled back from the support I had once given so freely. No more checks slipped into their hands, no more offers to cover bills just this once. When he hinted at money during casual conversations, I smiled faintly and said nothing, letting the silence hang until he grew uncomfortable. I could see the irritation flicker across his face, the suspicion beginning to grow, and that only strengthened my resolve. I also began cataloging everything I had done for them. Receipts, transfers, repairs I had funded out of my own pocket, turning what had once been gestures of love into evidence of how far I had gone and how little they had appreciated it. Every note I wrote, every file I stored in my drawer was a piece of the net I would one day tighten around him. He had no idea how vulnerable he truly was, how every foundation of his life rested on the generosity he mocked. It felt strange, almost exhilarating, to plan like this, to move like a man who still had power in his hands after believing for so long that it was gone. I was no longer the father, quietly absorbing every insult. I was the architect of his undoing, and every discreet transfer, every amendment to a document, every locked account was another brick in the wall closing around him. I moved carefully, knowing patience was my greatest weapon, because while he wallowed in arrogance, I was building a future where he would find himself cut off, isolated, stripped of the wealth and comfort he thought was rightfully his. For the first time in years, I felt not like a victim but like a man sharpening his blade in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That night, after another day of shifting papers and signatures that would go unnoticed by the arrogant fool who thought he had beaten me, I found myself standing at the door of the room I had not entered in months. My wife's room, the space I had preserved like a shrine to her memory, stood still and silent as I turned the knob and stepped inside. The air was different there, heavier somehow, as though her presence lingered in the faded perfume that still clung faintly to the curtains, in the photographs that lined the dresser, in the neatly folded blanket at the foot of the bed that she had once arranged with meticulous care. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, the springs creaking softly under my weight, and let my hand run across the quilt, feeling the years collapse into a single moment. I spoke to her then, in a low voice, my words spilling out into the silence as though she were sitting beside me. I told her what he had done, how he had taken the ring that symbolized everything we were and pawned it off like a trinket. My voice cracked as I confessed the depth of the betrayal, not just his, but the silence of our daughter, the way she could not or would not stand by me in that moment. I felt my throat tighten as I whispered that I was sorry. Sorry for allowing her memory to be mocked, sorry for being too patient for too long, sorry for not protecting the sacred symbol of our love. But as the words tumbled out, something shifted inside me, and sorrow gave way to resolve. I looked at her photograph, her smile frozen in time, and I swore aloud that she would not be disrespected in death, the way she had been cherished in life. He had taken her ring, but he would never take her honor, not while I still breathed. I vowed that I would protect her legacy, that every drop of sweat, every sacrifice, every ounce of love we had poured into building a life would not be reduced to ashes by his arrogance. She had been the foundation of my strength when she lived, and now in her absence she was the fire that fueled my determination. Sitting in that quiet room, bathed in the soft glow of the lamp she had once read by, I felt her presence steady me, reminding me of the man I once was, the man she believed I still could be. I whispered her name one last time before I rose, my chest filled with a cold, deliberate strength. He thought he had taken everything, but he had only awakened a storm he could not contain. I closed the door gently behind me, not as a retreat but as a promise, a silent oath that her memory would be avenged, her dignity restored, and that every step I took from this moment on would be for her. The weeks that followed were marked by a steady rhythm of silence and planning, every move I made hidden behind the mask of an aging man who appeared tired and harmless, while in truth I was weaving a net that would eventually tighten around his neck. I began by assembling every scrap of evidence I could find, tracing through years of transfers and withdrawals, compiling receipts of the countless times I had paid their bills, covered their mortgage payments, even funded their so-called renovations that were nothing more than excuses for him to squander money elsewhere. Each document told a story of manipulation and exploitation, and I organized them into files that painted the clearest picture of his dependence on me. I requested statements from banks, tracked down credit reports, and through my financial advisor's discreet inquiries, I discovered a string of accounts he had opened in reckless pursuit of easy money, many of them now overdue, several already in collections. These accounts revealed not just irresponsibility but deceit, for he had hidden them from my daughter, using her trust as a shield while he sank them deeper into danger. My lawyer guided me through legal safeguards, ensuring that every asset of mine was locked behind walls too high for him to climb. I altered my will so precisely that not even the craftiest attorney could argue his way into my estate. I placed the family home into a trust with stipulations that bypassed him entirely, ensuring that one day it would belong solely to my daughter and any children she might have, leaving him with no claim. I quietly filed paperwork that severed any future legal obligation between myself and his debts, erecting barriers that would leave him stranded when the collectors came knocking. Each visit to my lawyer's office, each signature I placed at the bottom of a page, was another stone in the trap I was building, stones that seemed so harmless alone, but together would form an unbreakable wall. Yet legal safeguards were not enough. I needed a moment of truth, a reveal so undeniable that his arrogance would crumble before witnesses who could never forget it. So I began to plan the stage. I knew his habits, his overconfidence, his belief that he could charm or bully his way through any situation. I would let him speak, let him boast, let him believe the control was still his, and then, when the time was right, I would lay the evidence before him piece by piece until the image he had so carefully crafted shattered to dust. The thought of it filled me with grim satisfaction, not because I relished cruelty, but because I knew justice often required a mirror, and I intended to hold that mirror steady until he could no longer look away. I could already see the gathering in my mind, the papers spread across the table, his face draining of color as truth stripped him bare. It would not be quick, and it would not be merciful, but it would be final. My wife's honor demanded nothing less, and my own dignity, long buried under years of silence, would finally rise. I watched him grow bolder in the weeks that followed, mistaking my silence for surrender, mistaking my distance for defeat. He strutted around my daughter's home like a king in his castle, puffing his chest and bragging to anyone who would listen about how he had everything under control. I heard him one evening as he poured himself a drink, laughing with one of his friends over the phone, his voice carrying easily through the walls as I sat in the kitchen pretending to read the paper. "The old man's harmless," he scoffed, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Always has been. He can't say no to her, never could, and as long as she's on my side, he'll keep paying up. He's too soft to cut us off, too guilty to watch us struggle. Hell, I've practically got him trained." His friend chuckled through the speaker, and he went on, his voice growing louder with alcohol and pride. "Besides, she doesn't dare cross me. She knows I handle things. If he ever tried to step out of line, she'd shut him down before he even opened his mouth. I've got this family wrapped around my finger, and soon enough I'll get more out of him. He doesn't even realize what I'm working on yet." I sat there, my hands tightening around the edges of the newspaper, the words blurring as his voice filled the house. Each arrogant laugh was another nail in his coffin, though he didn't know it. He believed himself invincible, convinced that manipulation and intimidation were strength. He thought my daughter's silence was loyalty, when in truth it was fear, and he mistook fear for respect. He had no idea that the ground beneath him had already shifted, that the lifeline he thought endless was already severed. My accounts were locked, my assets secured, my will rewritten, but he continued to gloat, blind to the quiet storm building around him. Later that night at dinner, he leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass as though he were a man of wealth and means, and announced with smug certainty that things were finally turning around. "Got a few ideas cooking," he told my daughter, giving her a wink that made her smile nervously. "We'll be fine. I always land on my feet. Your father worries too much, but he'll come around. He always does. He's predictable." I met his gaze then, steady and calm, and he smirked at me as if daring me to contradict him, certain that I would swallow the words like I always had. I only nodded slowly, letting him bask in his illusion, letting him believe his control was absolute. Because the deeper he sank into his own arrogance, the sweeter his fall would be when the time came. He was blind to the walls closing in, blind to the noose tightening, and in that blindness he revealed just how certain he was of his victory. That false confidence would be his undoing, and I savored the knowledge that soon, very soon, he would see just how wrong he had been. It was my daughter who began to sense it first, though she could not quite put her finger on what was happening. She noticed the way I had grown quieter, not in the defeated way I once had been, but in a deliberate, measured silence that carried weight. When she spoke to me, I listened carefully, answered gently, but I no longer offered the same reassurances I always had. I stopped reaching for my wallet at the smallest hint of need, stopped volunteering to fix what her husband had ignored. She noticed the distance in my eyes when I looked at her, the sadness there tempered by something stronger, something she could not yet name. At the same time, she noticed changes in him. His confidence had not vanished, but it wavered in the quiet moments when he thought no one was watching. His phone calls grew more frantic, his temper shorter, his drinking heavier. He paced more often, muttering under his breath when he thought she was asleep. At first, she tried to dismiss it, telling herself that life had always been stressful, that he was under pressure from work, from debts, from things he never fully explained. But when she looked at me and saw the way I no longer bent to his moods, the way I carried myself with a calm that unsettled even him, she began to suspect that something had shifted. One evening, as we sat together in her kitchen, she studied me quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "You've been different lately," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. I only smiled faintly, offering no explanation, because the time had not yet come. She bit her lip and glanced toward the living room where he sat loudly boasting on the phone, and for the first time I saw doubt flicker across her face. She was beginning to see what I had long known, that his confidence was a mask, and the cracks in it were growing wider. She noticed how he grew nervous when the mail arrived, how he snapped at her when she asked about bills, how his words grew sharper the more I refused to rise to his provocations. She noticed how I had begun spending time at my lawyer's office, how I carried folders with me and kept them close. She noticed that when he bragged about his so-called victories, my silence was no longer born of submission, but of something colder, something waiting. The tension in that house became a living thing, threading itself through every interaction, every meal, every quiet glance. She loved him still, or perhaps she clung to the idea of loving him, but love could not disguise the unease building in her chest. She could not say it aloud, not yet, but I could see it in her eyes. She was beginning to realize her husband was not the protector he pretended to be. And though she did not know what I was planning, though she could not yet understand the distance in my eyes, I saw the first cracks forming in the wall of silence that had once kept her bound to him. Soon she would see everything. Soon the truth would break through the illusions, and she would understand why her father had grown so distant, and why her husband had begun to unravel. I chose the evening carefully, waiting until the tension in that house had become so thick it could be cut with a knife, waiting until his arrogance was at its peak, and my daughter's doubts had begun to fester into questions she dared not yet ask. I called them both into the dining room, my voice calm, steady, carrying none of the anger that had once betrayed me. He sauntered in with that same smirk plastered across his face, a glass of whiskey in his hand, while my daughter followed quietly, her eyes already filled with unease. I laid the folders on the table, one by one, the weight of them echoing like stones dropped into a still pond, and for the first time his smirk faltered. "What's all this?" he asked, trying to sound dismissive, but his voice caught on the edge of something sharp. I looked at him directly and spoke in a voice that did not waver. "This," I said, tapping the first folder, "is every payment I ever made to cover your failures. Mortgage installments, utility bills, loans that weren't mine to pay, repairs you never lifted a finger to fix. Years of sacrifice that you took for granted." I opened the folder, spreading out the receipts and statements across the table. My daughter's eyes widened as she scanned the papers, her lips parting as though the ground beneath her was shifting. He scoffed, waving a hand. "So you helped out, big deal. Family's supposed to help each other." His arrogance cracked slightly, the edge of his voice sharper than before. I laid down the second folder, thicker than the first. "And this," I continued, my tone still calm, "is proof of your debts. Accounts you hid, credit lines you drained, collections notices you never told her about. You thought you could bury them, but the truth has a way of surfacing." I slid the documents toward my daughter, and she reached for them with trembling hands. Her face paled as she read, realization dawning with each line. "Is this true?" she whispered, her voice breaking as she turned to him, but he did not answer. Instead, he tried to laugh, a hollow sound that echoed against the walls. "You've been snooping. You don't understand how this works. I've got it under control. Finally, I opened the last folder, the one that carried the heaviest weight of all. I pulled out the copy of the pawn ticket, the record of the transaction that had stolen the last piece of my wife from me. I held it up between us and let the silence stretch. "And this," I said, my voice colder now, "is what you did to her memory. You sold my wife's wedding ring, the only piece of her I had left, to pay off a fraction of your shame. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed her, and you betrayed my daughter by dragging her into your filth." The room went still, my daughter staring at the slip of paper as if it were a knife pressed against her chest. His face drained of color, the smugness replaced with something raw and panicked. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. I leaned forward then, my voice dropping lower, each word cutting sharper than the last. "You thought I was weak. You thought I would always stay silent, always write the checks, always bow my head. But you underestimated me. Everything you built on my back is gone. My accounts, my assets, my estate, you have no claim to any of it. The lifeline you thought endless has been cut, and the world you thought you controlled is crumbling as we speak." My daughter's hand shook as she covered her mouth, her eyes darting between the evidence and the man she thought she knew. He sat frozen, his arrogance shattered, his lies exposed, his kingdom reduced to ashes in the span of minutes. I sat back, the storm inside me quiet at last, knowing the moment of reckoning had finally come. The silence that followed my words stretched unbearably until he finally snapped, slamming his glass onto the table so hard that whiskey splashed across the papers, his face twisting with rage as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "You think you can just waltz in here and ruin everything? You're a bitter old man who can't let go of the past." His voice cracked as he shouted, desperation leaking into every syllable. He turned to my daughter, grabbing at her arm, his tone shifting from fury to pleading in the span of a heartbeat. "Don't listen to him. He's trying to turn you against me. He doesn't want us to succeed. He never has. He's jealous. That's what this is." But she pulled her hand back, her eyes fixed on the papers spread across the table, the pawn slip trembling in her fingers. The color drained from her face as she whispered, "Is it true? Did you sell Mom's ring?" He opened his mouth, stammered, then closed it again, unable to form the lie fast enough. His silence was louder than any confession. He turned his fury back on me, his voice rising until it shook the walls. "You can't do this. You don't control me. You don't control her. I'm the man of this house, not you." He pounded his fist on the table, scattering the evidence across the wood, but every blow only made him look smaller, more pitiful, like a child throwing a tantrum. I remained seated, calm, watching him unravel, every frantic word another crack in his mask. He tried to bluster about business deals, about money coming in, about promises of control, but the documents lying between us told a different story. His debts were undeniable, his fraud documented, his betrayal stamped and dated. I slid one final sheet across the table, my voice steady as I spoke. "These have already been filed with my lawyer. Every asset is protected. Every debt is documented. You are cornered. And when the collectors come, they will find you with nothing to offer but excuses." His face twisted, the panic now impossible to disguise. He grabbed at the papers, trying to crumple them, shouting that none of it mattered, that I couldn't take his life away, but my daughter's voice, trembling but resolute, cut through his rant. "You already did that yourself." Her words silenced him more effectively than anything I could have said. He turned to her, eyes wide, betrayal written across his features as though he were the victim, but she could no longer look at him without seeing the truth. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. Not arrogant, not invincible, but exposed and humiliated, his confidence stripped away by the weight of undeniable evidence. His shoulders sagged, his eyes darting wildly as though searching for an escape, but there was none. Every path was blocked, every lie dismantled, every defense shattered. He had spent years building a life on sand, and now the tide had come to wash it all away. He slumped back into his chair, silent at last, the fury in his eyes replaced by the hollow look of a man who finally understood that his game was over. My daughter sat frozen at the table, the papers still spread before her like shards of glass, reflecting every lie she had ever been told. Her hands trembled as she clutched the pawn slip, the proof of what he had done, the proof that the one relic of her mother's love had been reduced to a bargaining chip for his debts. Her eyes brimmed with tears, wide and searching, darting between me and the man she had promised her life to. "Tell me it isn't true," she whispered, her voice breaking, but he offered no words, only sat slumped in his chair, with his face twisted in a mixture of rage and shame. The silence was answer enough, and it crushed her more than any confession could have. She pressed her hands to her mouth as sobs tore from her chest, the sound raw and unrestrained, the kind of grief I had not heard from her since the day we buried her mother. "All this time," she choked out, her shoulders shaking, "I thought you were protecting me, that you were building something for us. And you dragged me into this. You lied to me. You sold her ring." She collapsed forward, her forehead against her hands, tears spilling onto the documents that spelled out the ruin of the man she had trusted. He reached for her then, muttering something about love, about how he did it all for them, but she recoiled violently, her voice sharp through the sobs. "Don't touch me. You used me. You used him. You've used everyone." Her eyes finally met mine, and the weight of her guilt poured out through them, guilt for her silence, for the way she had allowed his voice to drown out her own, for the moments when she had stood beside him against me. "Dad," she whispered, her voice broken, "you were right. I didn't want to see it. I couldn't. But you were right about him all along." The words hit me like both a knife and a balm, cutting deep with sorrow but soothing with the truth at last spoken aloud. I wanted to gather her into my arms, to tell her none of it was her fault, but I stayed seated, letting her break, letting the truth pour from her without interruption. He tried once more, his voice rising in desperation, hurling words like weapons. "You think he cares about you more than I do? He just wants to control you, to control us. He's poisoning you against me?" But she shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face, her voice filled with a pain that silenced him at last. "No, you did that yourself. You sold the one thing that mattered most, and you didn't even care." The cruelty of his action stood undeniable between them, undeniable in the trembling of her hands, in the hollow sound of her sobs. The daughter I had raised, the girl who once clung to me in the absence of her mother, had finally seen the truth. She was torn, yes, between love and loyalty, but the veil had been ripped away, and she could no longer pretend the man she married was anything but a parasite who had feasted on her trust. Her breakdown was not weakness. It was the first step toward freedom, and though it shattered my heart to watch, I knew it was necessary. She had to see him for what he truly was. And now, with the evidence spread before her and her heart split open, she finally did. The days that followed the confrontation moved swiftly, each one carrying the weight of finality. My lawyer had prepared everything in advance, and with a few phone calls and signatures, the trap was sealed tight. The son-in-law discovered quickly that the lifelines he had depended on for so long were gone. The accounts he believed he could access were locked. The assets he thought he could eventually inherit had been shifted into trusts that bypassed him completely, and the debts he had tried so desperately to hide were now laid bare before collectors who wasted no time circling their prey. Letters arrived, calls poured in, and the smirk that had once been permanently etched on his face gave way to hollow eyes and a jaw clenched in fear. He tried to bluster, to insist that it was all temporary, that he had opportunities coming. But even my daughter could hear the hollow ring of his promises. The facade had crumbled, and in its place stood only a man cornered by his own greed. Meanwhile, I ensured that my daughter was shielded from the fallout. The trusts I had established secured her future, funds earmarked in her name and hers alone, untouchable by the man who had nearly dragged her into ruin. The house that once felt like a trap became a safety net, safeguarded through legal means so that even if he tried to sell it out from under her, he would find himself powerless. She wept when I explained it to her, not out of shame this time, but out of gratitude, her voice breaking as she told me she did not deserve the protection after all the ways she had stayed silent. I told her the truth. She was my daughter, and no silence could ever erase the love her mother and I had poured into her. Protecting her was not just duty, it was the fulfillment of the promise I had made to my wife, the promise that had kept me breathing all these years. For him, there was no escape. The evidence of his financial deceit and fraud was forwarded to the right channels, legal doors closing around him with a speed that left him stunned. The creditors who once tolerated his excuses no longer listened, not when they had documentation in their hands. He stood before my daughter and tried one last desperate plea, claiming he was being sabotaged, that I had engineered his downfall. I met his eyes then, calm and unflinching, and told him the truth. I hadn't ruined him, he had done it himself. I had only ensured he could no longer drag us down with him. His rage sputtered into silence, and when he finally realized there was nothing left for him to take, he walked out the door, stripped of the illusion of control he had clung to for years. Vindication washed over me not as triumph, but as peace. I had not raised my hand, I had not shouted, I had simply revealed the truth and protected what mattered. He was finished, financially ruined, legally cornered, and most importantly, permanently cut off from the family he had leached from for far too long. My daughter was safe at last, her future secure, and as I stood in the quiet of my home, I felt the first true breath of relief I had taken in years. Justice had been done. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that once haunted me after my wife passed, but this time it carried a different weight. I walked into her room and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on the quilt she had sewn so many years ago, and I let the stillness settle around me. The ring was gone, stolen, and pawned for debts that were never mine, and there was no undoing that loss. I would never hold it again, never feel its familiar weight against my skin, never trace the circle of love it represented. For a long time that truth might have broken me, but as I sat there I realized something had shifted. The ring was only a symbol, precious because of what it represented, but the love it carried had not been sold, had not been stolen, had not been lost. That love still lived in me and in the strength I had finally found to protect what we built. He had tried to turn my silence into weakness, to twist my generosity into servitude, but in the end, it was my resolve that endured. I had shielded our daughter, secured her future, and stripped him of the power he thought he held over us. The ring may have been reduced to cash in the hands of a pawnbroker, but its true value had been reborn in the justice that followed. My wife's memory was not desecrated because I had refused to let it end with his cruelty. I had honored her not with gold but with action, not with jewels but with resolve. I thought of her smile, the way she used to look at me with pride when I fixed something with my hands, when I stayed strong during hard times, when I refused to give in to despair. I whispered to her in the quiet, telling her I had finally stood tall again, that I had finally defended her legacy the way she deserved. My voice did not tremble this time, because I knew she would have been proud. Justice had been served. He was gone, cut off, and ruined, and we were free of his shadow. My daughter's tears had given way to a fragile strength, and though the road ahead would not be easy, she would no longer walk it with chains around her ankles. And as for me, I had found something I thought I had lost forever: the will to fight, the clarity to act, the peace that comes when truth is no longer buried under silence. The ring is gone, yes, but the love it symbolized is eternal. It lives in every sacrifice, every memory, every choice to protect rather than surrender. It lives in the strength I finally showed, strength that came too late for the ring, but not too late for the woman I loved or the daughter we raised. And as I rose from the bed, I felt lighter, as though for the first time in years the weight of grief had given way to peace. My wife's memory endures, not in gold, but in the man I chose to become. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.